Okay, the council will now go into 3 work sessions and starting with demystifying Washington State property taxes with our county assessor, Peter Van Norwick, and treasurer, Alicia Hopper. Welcome.
Just looking up there, it looks like such an exciting presentation.
We're ready to be demystified.
Yes, we're going to captivate you. Well, good morning, counselors, chair. For the record, I'm Alicia Topper, the elected Clark County Treasurer.
Peter Van Norwick, Clark County Assessor.
And for today's discussion, we're going to be visiting with you about our property tax system here in Washington State. For the session today, just as a quick overview, we're going to be reviewing high-level and generalized concepts. You can go ahead and just follow me. I'm going to say next slide because we do have some transitions which might be a little clunky, so bear with us, but I think it'll be better for illustrative purposes. So anyway, we're going to be we're going to be trying not to overcomplicate our system. We're going to be talking about generalized concepts. We're also going to be talking to the exceptions in property taxes, which aren't readily known to most individuals. And we're also going to be talking about systems that you may not know as elected officials. Both Peter and I would guess that the majority of electeds here in our state don't truly understand how our property tax system works. And we just want to make a note for citizens who are watching and for you, this is not a levy training. So there are some very technical calculations that Peter's staff conduct in the assessor's office, and we will not be going over those today. So if we are throwing concepts at you that seem overly complex, or they're not making sense, please stop and ask Peter all the questions. And finally, we're going to talk about the role of local government since you are setting the county's budget and you are impacting property taxes somewhat. We're also going to talk about the property tax rates and limitations, your property tax and your rates. So we'll have some individual property tax samples to show you today. And then finally, we're going to explain how to calculate property taxes. So what are property taxes? Well, property taxes are the most widespread form of taxation in the state and at the local level in the United States. Washington has had property taxes since it was formed as a territory in 1853. In Washington State, property taxes are collected on both real property, which is land and buildings, and personal property, which is equipment and furnishings of businesses. At the state level, you do get taxed to state levy 1 and 2, and that's 100% to fund schools, public schools. And at the local level, it's a major general fund resource for most taxing districts, including the county. And the state legislature is the entity and the elected body that can create new property tax authorities. And that's basically determining who has the authority to tax property. In counties, we have 39 counties in Washington State, and here in Southwest Washington, Clark County has 182 unique levy codes, and we have over 40 taxing districts. That means we have 40 entities that have the ability to levy taxes or assessments. And for managing this system here in the county, you have myself, treasurer, and you have the assessor.
So I'll just talk a little bit first about is it on now? Oh, okay. I guess the light's on. That means it's off. Okay. So the number one role of the assessor, and I've talked to almost all of you before, you've all come into my office. So a lot of you, this will be information you've already heard. But the number one job of the assessor, and the reason why it's an elected position, is I am the person that protects the taxpayers from overtaxation. That is the overarching reason why the assessor is elected position. So we only answer to the people of Clark County. So what I do as the assessor is I determine the value of all taxable and personal properties for businesses within Clark County for the purpose of taxation. I calculate, I set the levy rates, and I certify the tax roll. Every year I update all the market values for all the properties in Clark County. Our office brings in all the business personal property listings and then do the audits. We also run the senior exemption and deferral programs, which, you know, we've talked about before, and we do current use. So I say overarching, the assessor, one of the things I say is because I'm elected to protect what's called the highest lawful levy. And we'll go into the highest lawful levy later and how that works, but that is kind of the premium role of the assessor, is that highest lawful levy.
And the reason I'm up here with Peter today is because we work hand in glove in partnership. Once he certifies the tax roll, he submits it to my office, and I have to certify that I've received it. And that certified tax roll is what we use to generate tax bills. So once he hands over the tax roll, we get started on generating tax statements. And it's my statutory responsibility to ensure that every taxpayer has a tax bill. So that's what my office works on in February through May. April 30th is the due date for first installment, and October 31st for second installment. So we have a very cyclical cycle around our property tax collection. On the slides that you were provided, it also goes over the other duties of my office, but I'll be specific in just speaking about our property tax roll today. So we're going to just start with assessed value. I think this is one of the most misunderstood elements of our property tax system for most citizens. So most folks know assessed value is the value of property for the purpose of taxation. So Peter and his team are ensuring that everyone is getting their property assessed at 100% of fair market value. So that's his duty at the state, is try to get as close to fair market as possible. He assesses properties uniformly, not by the purchase price. So if you just recently purchased a home or you got your home assessed by a private assessor, that is not the same as what the county is doing. It's different. Assessed value is also using mass appraisal, which Peter will cover today. So it's not at an individual property level, it's at a mass appraisal level. And then the assessments are at the highest and best use. So that means if you own a property and it is multiple acres and you can build multifamily, but you've got one tiny single family residence, that's probably not the highest and best use. Peter's team is going to assess it at its highest and best use. There are some exceptions, which are agricultural and forest properties. They can be assessed at its current use. And that's something that his team does, is they manage a current use program. And it took a constitutional amendment to allow that assessment to be different than all other assessments. Uniformity, Peter, kind of talk about what that means.
So uniformity, in the bottom line, what it means is that similar properties need to have the same assessed values. Tax rates are imposed by each jurisdiction, and they must be the same throughout the boundaries. A lot of times people come from other states. They may have different tax rates for residential than they do for commercial, than they do for other types of property. Ours, the tax rate is the same throughout the entire tax base. So when we have a tax rate for Clark County, doesn't matter if you live in the city of Vancouver or Yakult or unincorporated, the tax rate, mill rate, which is rate per thousand, is the same for everyone throughout the taxing district. Any exception to that would actually require a constitutional amendment. So I just want to talk a little bit about mass appraisal. And I think I have talked to all of you before, but in this example here, we have 7 homes, right? And I always say, this is an Ajo subdivision. They're all on the same street. They look the same. They're built the same year. They're all the same size. Everything about them is the same, right? But one sold for 200,000, one sold for 205, one sold for 215, one sold for 210, one sold for 220, another one sold at 205, and then another one sold at 215. So what we look at, we say, okay, these homes have a range of value between 200,000 and 220,000, because looking at the market sales, that's what we are being told in terms of the market and looking at this value. So the next slide. So when it comes to mass appraisal, one of the things we don't do is we don't go to the sales price. And there's some states where they do go to the sales price for assessed value, but we don't do that. What we do is we build a model. And because all these homes are exactly the same, we have to put the same assessed value on these properties. And we will go analyze those sales, put those characteristics into a model, and then the model will come out with the number. And in essence, we're not actually valuing the house itself, we're really valuing the market value of the characteristics of that house. So in this example, because all those 7 homes were exactly the same, even though they sold from 200,000 to 220,000, the assessed value on all of them is going to be 210,000, right? And so when we go in there and we put all that value on it, you know, the first thing that's going to happen, right? Person that bought it for 200,000 is going to call up everyone they know and say, hey, you've overassessed our home because I bought it for 200,000. It's assessed at 210, you know, and the person that bought it for 220 is like, everyone knows the assessed value is low, right? But in essence, we have to analyze all the sales. We can't do what's called chase sales. We have to value through the model. And then in a perfect assessed value model, right, is we're going to come back with a value of 210,000, right? The mid-range of that. And then we need to place it on all those homes, all the homes that sold, even though they sold for more or less, and all the other homes that are similar to it within that neighborhood. We're also going to place that same uniform value on them. So all the properties will have that same uniformity, and that's the uniformity of the property tax system. So when it comes, this is just a number to kind of show actually how big Clark County is. And so you see the total assessed value for 2024, assessed values of all of Clark County was 105 billion, 166 million, $548,847. So you see that there's a lot of property and a lot of value of our property within Clark County.
And once Peter and his team have generated the assessed value for the county, the next step is to calculate property taxes. And this is something that, oh, it looks like did you turn this into a PDF? That's okay. So if this was a PowerPoint presentation, what you would have seen is a layering, because it's important that each junior taxing district has a boundary. So you may have a neighbor who lives across the street from you, and they may be in an absolutely different tax code area than where you are, because each district has a boundary and where they can collect and assess property taxes. So the cities, you would have seen the dark brown line at the bottom, that was the city of Vancouver in their boundary layer. And then it overlaid school districts. So you would have seen all of our school district boundary areas, all the way from Vancouver School District, Camas, all the way through Green Mountain way up north. And the ports, you would have seen an overlaying of each of our port districts. And then you would have seen an overlaying of all of our fire districts. So you would have been able to kind of take a gander at the map, roughly place your house on that map, and you would have seen of those 4 samplings where you would have lied within those districts. So someone on 78th Street outside of the city of Vancouver, because they're to the north, probably still would have been in Vancouver Public Schools and the Port of Vancouver, whereas they would not have been within the city of Vancouver. So their tax statement would have looked different than the person across the street from them. So most folks don't understand the district boundaries and why some things are on their property taxes and others are not.
Chair,
Go ahead.
we ask questions.
Yes, of
Sure.
course.
How are those boundaries set? Like for the port, for example?
Well, typically at the beginning, they're set up in as far as that governing entity. But for example, let's just say they want to add some parcels into that, then they go to the process of annexation. And annexation is actually something that is run out of my office. So what would happen is that those property owners, in most cases, it's property owners want to be annexed into a governmental entity, right? They will go to the governmental entity, say, hey, we want to be annexed in. As long as they own 60% of the value of the properties to be annexed in, the city can say, or the port or whatever can say, okay, yeah, we want to accept these properties in. Then the board will pass it. Then that information will come to my office, and then my office will run the annexation, the mapping, and the overall process. And then when we're done running through the annexation process, then it goes to the treasurer's office, and then they map the funds and the transfer of funds.
So when the entity is established, the boundary line is established. If it changes in the future, it's through annexation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Thank you.
So I guess next slide. Our property tax system is what's called a budget-based system. And what that means is that when you vote on your budget, you are setting the property tax and how much is going to be collected within your taxing district. One of the myths that seems to be out there that seems to be very prevalent is property taxes are raised or not raised by the vote for whether or not you're going to take the 1%. That's actually incorrect. The 1% vote is just to let the public know that on top of the other property tax increases that you can take through new construction and annexation, you are going to increase it 1% again. The actual raising of the property taxes happens when you take the vote on the budget and say, this is the amount that we want to collect in property taxes, right? Because in the state of Washington, everything has to balance. So in that budget, you have a amount that you want to collect in property taxes, and it's down to the penny. And we'll go into that in the next slide. By November 30th of each year, the amount of taxes to be levied by taxing districts are certified to my office, the county assessor. And what we do at that point is, this is where I talked about how we protect the taxpayers comes into it. When they send me in what they approved in their budget, I take that budget number that they approved and I compare it to what's known as the highest lawful levy. And the highest lawful levy is exactly what it sounds like. It is the most that a tax district can collect under Washington state law in property taxes. And so let's just say, I'll make it easy. It's 100 million, right? So if the budget comes in and it's 100 million and my highest lawful levy is 100 million, I say, okay, good. We will collect that 100 million. If you send it in to me and it's 101 million, and I look and I says the highest lawful levy is 100 million, what's going to happen is then my office is going to contact the taxing district and go back and say, I'm sorry, but you asked for 101 million. You can only collect 100 million. You need to go back and redo your budget because you can't collect more than the highest lawful levy. And then typically 1st of December, sometime around mid-December, if that happens, then they need to go in and readjust their budget because everything has to add up, right? The amount of money you want to collect must be reflected in the budget and reflected in the money that you're spending because everything has to balance out. Once it comes in and it passes that it meets the highest lawful levy, then I calculate what the levy rate is to collect that total amount from the entire tax base. So it's a kind of a simple formula, and I'll go into a little bit more later, but it's basically the budget divided by the total assessed value gives you the tax rate. And by law, this number is expressed as a rate per thousand. So it's basically a mill rate because if you had $1 and it's 0.001, which is a mill. So it's really the rate that we go on and what is assessed on is what is called a mill rate. And so you'll hear the term mill rate, and it mainly means what is the rate per $1,000 of assessed value.
There'll be a quiz later.
Yeah. You guys any questions on that?
I have a question just
Sure.
as an example. So as property values have been going up. How does that impact
Oh, we'll talk about
the
that.
rate? Are
We'll
we
talk
getting
about-
to that?
Yeah, we'll
Because
talk
I
about
think
that.
that's what confuses so many
Yes.
people.
But
Yep.
the thing to understand is it is a budget-based system. We go to the next slide. This is the actual levy certificate that was sent to my office in December 2024. And if you look at it, you'll notice that every single one of these numbers are written right down there, down to the exact cent. And that's what was, and if you look up there in this levy certification, you'll notice that's what it says is certified to me as what was passed in the budget. So all these numbers that are here, they have to reflect what was in that budget that was passed. And then the budget office, when you pass the budget, they take those numbers, then they certify those values to us. And the same thing happens with all the other taxing districts. All the other taxing districts are all sending me similar levy certifications that has, this is the dollar amount that we want to collect down to the exact cent. And it doesn't matter if assessed values are going up or down, we are going to collect the amount of property taxes that was passed by the elected body. And every one of these property taxes that comes to us, there is elected body that has voted on it in terms of their budget. So next slide. This is the general levy property tax history. And just thing I want to say is, if you sit on a council, if you sit on an elected board, you will raise property taxes. There's just no way around it. That's the job that you have. When you pass the budget, you raise property taxes in there. And say there's a couple ways that you raise property taxes, and we'll get into more in depth. You have new construction, and the value that's added for new construction adds the amount you could collect in property taxes. And then whether or not you choose to vote for the 1% on top of that, that adds on additional property taxes. But both of them are raising the levy of property taxes, because under Washington state law, if you collected $100 one year and the next year you want to collect $100.01, you're raising property taxes, because it's all based upon the number that's in the budget. So if you look at, for example, 21 to 22, the amount that we increased property tax collections went up 3%. You'll notice also that the difference in the assessed values went up 10%. So as part of the formula, because when assessed values go up, the tax rate comes down. You'll see that also in 2021, the tax rate was 0.96, and in 2022 was 0.89. So there's a 3% property tax increase collected between 21 and 22. Between 22 and 23, it went up 4%. 23 to 24, another 3%, and then between 24 and 25, a 2%. And the numbers that I put in there, those are all general fund numbers. By the way, I just went off the sheets that I showed you before and just kind of, talking about the general fund, because you start getting into more and more and more and more, it just gets more confusing. So I just really focused on the general fund, and that is the tax that everyone in Clark County is going to pay. So as you can see that every year, the amount of property taxes that is being asked from my office to collect does increase. Whether people say they didn't increase property taxes or not, it still goes up. So the next slide. What impact does the county council have on property taxes? So here I have a beautiful $100 bill. And this is a $100 bill that's going to be sent into the treasurer's office for the payment of property taxes. And you see over there a beautiful 7.5 cents. That's the impact that a county councilor has when they take the 1% property tax increase. Out of the $100 of property tax, it's not even 7.5 cents. Alicia said, oh, it's 7.5 cents. It's actually 7.4 cents. So it's 7.4 cents out of $100. That's the impact of saying, I want to take the 1%. Of course, it's up to, every board, whether or not they want to take that tax increase or not. But that is the actual impact for the county council on it, because the county is such a small percentage of all the taxing districts that are out there. The majority of that bill, $9 and something is all the other taxing districts.
Mhm.
So the actual impact you as a county councilor has on impacting individuals within Clark County's property taxes is 0.074%.
Sure. When I came into your office, this was really interesting to find this out. And it seems like the public might not be aware of this. And do you have this in a simple to digest format that is on your website that describes where all the sources are coming from? I know it's a very complex topic. This is an easy way to explain it, but do you have that anywhere where the public can see that?
We talk about it. No, it's not something, because we're not specifically ever looking at one particular tax district,
Mhm.
because for us, the county is just a taxing district, right? You're no different to us than the school districts, the cities, the fire departments, right? And so this information you can find it on our website, because all the data from how much people have asked for collection and property taxes, what the rates are, we put out annual reports. But to bring it to each individual taxing district and say, hey, this is what your impact of your vote is kind of outside of our role, just more in terms of educating, you as counselors. And, like I says, is when I bring people in, I do tell them your impact is a lot less than you really think on property taxes. I know the public thinks a county councilor has a huge impact on the property taxes, but in essence, you really got,
Yeah.
this
This is my second round through this because of you helped me out the first time, and it's taken at least two, and it's my job to know this. I'm just wondering if we can demystify it
Mhm.
more for the public as well, because they're the ones paying. So I just wanted to know if there's a way that we could make it more clear to the public how it's spread out. And
Yeah,
how it works.
I
have an-
believe the budget office puts together an
Yeah.
annual report. It's a few pages. It shows $1, everything split out, like what goes to schools and fire departments. So there is that information, but the
And we'll-
assessor doesn't put it out.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll have some examples of what's on the tax statement, which does itemize every district and the dollar amount. So we'll kind of go over that, but we're always open to invites to neighborhood associations, community groups. I've done a very similar presentation to this to a group of retiring seniors, and yeah, so we're always trying to educate.
Okay, thank you.
So next slide.
So this is the property tax formula, and say it's from the revenue, the budget, divided by the total assessed value. Assessed value equals the tax levy rate. So for example, and I'm going back to the slide that I did before where I showed you those 7 houses that I assessed at 210,000, just for sake of an example. So let's just say you had a $10,000 budget, right? And you took those 7 houses, each at 210,000 assessed value. That would be a total assessed value of 1.47 million. And that would come down to a tax rate of 0.0068202,721. And I didn't break this down into a mill rate because, so you take that value times each of the $210 of assessed value, and you come up with $1,100 $428.57 that's owed in property taxes. You can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, so once the levy rate is calculated, that's what, as Peter mentioned, is used to calculate the total taxes due. So this is the back of a tax statement. So there's a tax statement that's generated for every billable property in Clark County. For those who pay on their own, we mail a tax statement twice a year. And for those that pay through escrow, we take a digital version of their tax statement and we post it to the Property Information Center. So every citizen within Clark County has access to this information. As you'll notice in this comparison of tax history, so we show the prior year taxes that are billed as a levy rate and a dollar value. And then the current year taxes, which are being billed, will show the levy rate and the current year taxes due. And then in the final column to the right, we show the percent difference in that levy rate and the percent difference in the taxes. So you can see in this example, this home had an assessed value increase of 4.64%. And if you go through the line items for each of these districts, you'll notice that the portion of the county taxes that increased was less than 1% per fund. So even though they had an assessed value of almost 5% increase, their tax rate still decreased. And so that is where people get confused. They believe because their assessed value went up, that their property taxes are going to go up proportionately. But because, to Peter's point, Washington State is a budget-based system, we cannot collect more money than what was approved in the budget. So if you have a fixed amount you can collect and everyone's assessed value skyrocket, you can still only collect the budget that was approved. So your rate has to go down. Make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
So the next slide shows you the front tax of the tax statement. It has a small panel that gives you a distribution breakdown by district. So if you look at this tax statement example, you'll see Clark County and the Clark County Roads and Conservation Futures. You'll see Clean Water Program. But you'll also see state schools parts 2 and 3, which are the third and fourth item on that list. And you'll also see the second item, which is Vancouver School District. So if you look at the items that are the most or the highest in taxation per district, you'll notice that the school districts are the largest percentage of our tax statements. And on this particular example, it was a voter approved, meaning the voters approved to tax themselves for a bond or a levy, and that made up 35.5% of this tax bill. Not because their elected officials raised their taxes, but because they chose to value something, a new school, a new facility, enough to pay for it. So that is really important for voters to understand and for your citizens to understand, is a large portion of their tax bill is voter approved.
So just to hammer home the fact that assessed values raising does not increase the amount that's going to be collected in property taxes. This next year, the value of the homes increased 10%. So all those homes that were assessed now at 210 are now going to be assessed at 231, those 7 homes. But because, people held the line on taxes, right? The budget is still 10,000. And instead of it being a total assessed value of 1.47 million, the new assessed value is $1,617,000. You'll notice that the levy rate then went from 0.0068 to 0.00618. And of course, all the other numbers that are going on, because we actually do calculate that far out. But you take that new tax rate of 231, or the new assessed value times the tax rate of 231,000 times the new tax rate, and you will see that the property taxes to be collected from each person are $1,428.57, right? So the fact that the assessed values across the board increased and the total assessed value was higher because we're still collecting the 10,000, that has no impact in terms of whether or not people's property taxes are going to increase. So the next slide, this comes from MRSC. And this is just an example of, say, if you have
Oh, I have a typo. I apologize. MRSC, not MSRC.
oh, thank you,
Yes,
Alicia.
you're welcome.
But this is just, let's just say you had a couple homes. One was, they were both $50 in this example. So the county-wide total was $2. The levy rate is $2, and then because the tax bill is $100 total, so the total collected is $200. So the next year, everyone gets a 1% increase. But this time, home one is 150 and home two is 50, right? And because the tax increased 1%, we're collecting 202,000. And the reason why this is important is to understand is when tax rates are changing, but we also have assessed value in people's total assessed value. Perhaps the year before, right, these were just two bare lots. And then someone went and put an improvement on it, right? So the next year, this one has an improvement. So what happens is when someone's assessed values are going up faster than the rest of the county, you have what's called a tax shift. And everything that we do in property taxes, you have to understand, is shifting property taxes. So every time that someone goes on the senior exemption program, right, or goes into current use, and their tax bill decreases, it's not the different tax districts they're not shorted money because those people's property tax bills went down. That money is then shifted onto the rest of the tax base to be collected, because we are always going to collect 100% of what was improved in each of the different tax districts' budget. Does that make sense, everyone?
So there are special considerations in our property tax system. There is a limit on the tax rate. As you know, we have a 1% constitutional limit, which is $10 of 1,000 of assessed value. We have a $5.90 limit on cities, counties, and junior taxing districts. And we also have a limit on the government's annual revenue growth, which is 1%. And that's what the county manager will come with her recommendations of whether taking the 1% or not, plus new construction, which Peter touched on. There are no limits on the growth of individual assessed values or tax bills. So that's another misconception. People think that their property taxes cannot go up by more than 1%. That is not true. It is the budgets that are limited, not your property tax bills.
So exactly how does new construction increase property taxes? And I will say too, it is definitely an increase in property taxes when you take new construction. So what happens is when we come up and we have a levy rate, if there's new construction that's built, we're able to take that new construction times the levy rate, and that gives us the amount of new construction we could add. So in this new construction, this example I have, it's a $400,000 home, and I'm using the 2022 mill rate, right? So it was the 400 times 0.89 cents comes to $356. So we take that $356, we take that to the prior year's highest lawful levy, and we say, okay, it's the highest lawful levy plus that $356. So for 2023, the highest lawful levy increased by that $366. So the next year property taxes come out, right? And we have that new construction, and its assessed value was at 400, right? And if you remember back to the chart I showed you, the mill rate in 2023 was 0.77 cents. So for that house, the tax bill for the county was actually $308. The remaining $48, what happens to it, right? It is shifted onto the rest of the tax base. So when you have new construction and you have increasing in assessed values and growth and the tax rate going down, that does mean that new construction dollars aren't totally borne by the new construction. Because that rate's going down, they're paying a lesser amount, the rest is being shifted onto the tax base. Now, if you have a situation where it's a new building, and let's just say it's a nonprofit, right? We get new construction while it's being built. They're not exempt from property taxes until they are fulfilling what they are supposed to be doing as a nonprofit, right? So you may actually have the entire value of that building was added as new construction, but in essence, they're not going to pay the taxes because they're tax exempt. So that amount then shifts, it goes onto the highest lawful levy and is shifted onto the rest of the tax base.
Is that the same way that the multifamily tax exemption works?
Yes. Yeah, those taxes are being shifted onto the tax base because during the construction, again, that it's being added as new construction because it's not being used as its intended use for which it is being exempted.
Chair?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I just had a question on the previous slide about limits on tax rates. The $5.90 limit on counties. Where are we as a county compared to that limit?
Well, the $5.90, which we have a slide, 2 slides from now, that limit includes more than just the county.
Okay, I'll wait.
Okay.
All right. So max regular property tax rate. And this isn't really an issue now. But I tell you, in 2012, 2013, this was a huge issue. Under the state constitution, property taxes are limited to 1% of the assessed value, which works out to a mill rate of $10 per thousand. But if you were here in 2012, 2013, you would see that a lot of people's mill rate was at $16, $17 per thousand. That was pretty common. And the reason it's able to go above the $10 per thousand is voters can approve to go above that constitutional 1% max. So 1% max is held unless the voters in a vote go and choose to collect more than, the 1%. So a lot of times excess levies, bonds, those different things that voters vote on, they allow us to go above the $10 per thousand. So I don't remember if you remember the whole discussion about McCleary, right? The financing of the schools. That whole question really was boiling down to, should we be paying schools above the 1% statutory max or below the 1% statutory max? So should those school levies be under that $10 or above the $10?
And if you go to the next slide, we can kind of show that in a graph. So this chart essentially shows that $10 limit allocated by district type. And the aggregate limit, to Peter's point, for most but not all taxes for taxing districts, which are cities, counties, and most special purpose districts, is limited to $5.90 per 1,000 of assessed value. So if you look at the bottom portion of this graph, it shows the state. So they can levy up to $3.60 per 1,000. The next stack is your local districts. So that's your counties, your cities, metropolitan parks districts, your fire authorities, and others. So aggregate, all of our levies can't exceed that $5.90. And Peter has to make sure that all of those districts are staying within their lawful limits. And they have a pecking order of who's is the priority over others. So if we're bumping up against that $5.90 and going over, he has to cut back, and he does that based on statutory priority. And then that last little remaining levy capacity is for EMS levies, affordable housing levies, and others. Now, levies that can go above the $10 limit, which Peter touched on, are excess levies. So those are operation and maintenance levies that are approved by voters, levies that will cover the debt service on voter approved bonds, etc. And some ports and PUD levies are also an exception to that $10 limit.
That's on the next slide.
So, oh, look at me, I'm ahead. We're
Yeah,
cruising.
yeah.
So, as I said, there are some exceptions. 1 year excess levies, for those that don't know, essentially are for any purpose, but they require a 60% yes vote. So they require a supermajority. And then excess levies for capital require a 60% yes vote. So you'll see most school district bonds, those require a 60% yes vote. And then levy lid lifts raise the 1% revenue growth limit, but not the jurisdiction's rate limit, and require a simple majority of 50%.
So I guess to explain that, because for example, if next year you wanted to, after you took new construction, you say what we collect in property taxes is not sufficient, even taking the 1%, then if you want to go to the 1%, and it's actually the lesser of the consumer price index or 1%, but you want to go above the 1%, you can do that, but you have to go out to the people of Clark County and take a vote on it. And the people can go and they can vote to bring in additional revenue. But as Alicia said, they can't vote to bring you in more revenue than your levy limit.
So once we've levied and sent our tax statements out and everyone understands our tax system, now where does all that money go? So this pie chart shows you for 2024, the property taxes that were levied by the type and tax districts in Clark County. So as you'll see on this chart, state schools is 25% of our overall revenue that we're collecting through property taxes in Clark County. The county itself, if you look at roads and the county, you'll see that it's a combined rate of about 10.5%. Local schools is another 34%. So if you look at the state schools and local schools, that's more than half of your pie. So schools really do get the most support from our property tax dollars. And then all the other fire districts and libraries and cities and towns and ports make up the rest of that pie. So property taxes are a major source of revenue and lifeblood for taxing districts in Washington state. It is a budget-based system. The governing body and usually their constituents who vote you in are giving you the power to increase property taxes up to 1% by law. If you want more, you ask them and they may say yes.
I think one of the key things to understand about property taxes is the importance of property taxes. It's your most stable form of revenue. I know some prior councils, they kept talking about leakage. There's no leakage in property taxes, right? There's no non-collecting of property taxes. Eventually we can, we won't go into personal property taxes, but on real property, right? If we don't collect it, eventually we're going to have to go out and foreclose on that property. So we always get paid the property taxes. Those property taxes you can count on are going to be brought into county. And for example, one of the other things is let's just say we have 100 million to collect. I'm just using a nice round number. And let's just say a couple million wasn't being able to be collected because we had people going on the senior exemption program, people going into current use, different things that adjusted
The tax roll.
the tax roll so that we weren't able to collect that money. The next year you're able to collect that money in what's called an administrative refund, right? Because under the state law, the amount that we collect in property taxes has to match eventually, right? Because that requirement to have that balanced budget. And so that is your most stable form of funding, is because
Yeah,
over
when-
the period of time.
Yeah,
you're
when
going to
you
get that.
see the revenue assumptions in your budget, the budget office will put forward their sales tax assumptions, property tax assumptions, and other fees for service. We collect 99% of property taxes in the current year. The other 1% you will get within the next 3 years, because if someone doesn't pay, we will foreclose and auction off that home for those base taxes. So property taxes, to Peter's point, is the most stable form of taxes and revenue for the county.
Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on my question before about the limits. So in for the $10 per mil limit, is that what's happening? Are we at the $10 limit, and does our county take the $5.90 limit, or where are we at for our county of those numbers?
So currently, whereas our rate is down on slide 15, 74 cents. So we are well below even
Okay.
where being any close to the statutory limit.
Okay, that's important to note. I was
I
not
think-
clear on that.
I mean, even I think 10 years ago when we were actually hitting the 590, our tax rate, I want to say, was around $1.50. So there is a lot of room below that 590 for the
So
county.
we are at 74 cents
Yeah, for the general
of the
fund.
590. Okay,
For the general fund, yeah.
I did not know that. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, other questions?
Yes, could we go back to slide 15?
Sure.
And
That's-
590, just to clarify, is for all of those other taxing districts, not just the county.
That was really fast. Okay, so this I think is a good thing to illustrate, and what I would love to see added to this, and this can help to explain the deficit that we experience at the county, is if you took and you look at the difference in the actual revenue that the county gets, 2%, 3%, 4%, 3% over those years. And if you stuck another box next to it that showed inflation,
Yeah.
that would be a perfect description. Because if the levy amount doesn't change, two things still happen. Inflation still happens, and added services because new construction has come in. So now there are more people that you're providing services for. And if your levy amount doesn't go up, but those two things increase, you have a problem. You have to cut back on the services that you provide. That's the only way you can balance the system. It's not a perfect picture because it doesn't show the entirety of the revenue that goes into the general fund, but I think it's a good way of helping the public to understand that the levy amount has to keep up with inflation and with the number of new people moving in here that the services cost the county in order for us to maintain the same level of service. Not even increasing services, but maintaining.
So I'm glad you and I would like to kind of address the structural deficit, right? Because when you have the highest lawful levy, right? And if you tax at the highest lawful levy, because you take that highest lawful levy, and that you come up with a tax rate, let's just say it's $1, right? So that $400 house, right? It's $1 that adds $4 to, or $400 to the highest lawful levy, right? If you're not collecting at the highest lawful levy because you're choosing not to increase the 1%, like the road fund, I think is at 96%. I think it was like 4%, about 4% bank capacity. That means instead of getting $1 for every $1 of new construction, you're getting 96 cents. And so not being at the highest lawful levy is what you're doing is you are accelerating, you're pushing the accelerator all the way down on
Yep.
on the structural deficit. It's like you know, it's compounding interest, right? But it's compounding the wrong way, and you're accelerating it. So
And
it
if-
is important to understand that.
And if I can just add, and I shared this during the budget hearing, 6 out of the last 12 years, the council opted to not take the 1%. That would have cost an average homeowner about $18 to $24 a year. And it cost the county in loss of revenue of 37.5 million. And I understand that the annual amount can look low. It's like $750,000, but it does compound, as they mentioned, but it also compounds the wrong way. So that's where we lost that revenue that would have had a very minimal impact on a homeowner.
And I'm, I'm neutral and a nonpartisan elected. And what I always refer to is the voters already spoke about the 1%. They voted to cap local governments to raise their budgets and raise the rate by 1%. And so that decision has already been made. And it always baffles me when the very few entities and districts in the state that don't take the 1%, and it's like you're going against what the people said you could take. So I'm not quite sure the
And say
the argument around it, honestly.
it's not understanding compounding, the
Yes.
compounding impact of it too.
Yeah.
And the shortage of the new construction revenue that you are creating by not doing that.
Yep, thank you. And then just one other comment to kind of illustrate a point is, I had a constituent reach out to me early or late 2023. I think that was the year that we did elect to take the 1%. And she was upset about taxes being raised. And I understand that. I totally understand that. But we went through and we looked at her actual, her
Statement.
tax receipt, not receipt, but what's it called?
Statement.
Statement. Thank you. And we looked in, I showed her all the different categories. Well, guess how much? This is how much you're paying to the county. And, this illustrates the tax shift that you're describing, because we looked year over year, and in 2024, she was going to pay less than she paid in 2023 because her property had raised in value less than the rest of the inventory in the county. So very, very interesting subject. And I think most people really are surprised to see how little their property tax bills are actually changing, unless there's a voted levy of some sort.
And I think one of the things is to understand historically, what I've seen since I've been assessor is back in 2013, 2014, our tax rate was about the same as the fire districts, right? And the fire districts are levy limited to $1.50 per thousand. And we were at about $1.50 per thousand. And because of the increase of assessed value, right, that rate goes down, and our rate has gone down to 74 cents. And you see almost every fire district, they'll go out every few years and they'll go to the voters to get their levy rate re-up to the $1.50, right? And so we're actually collecting now probably about half for the county as we do for fire, when even 10, 11 years ago, it was about equal.
Okay. Any more questions?
The last one.
Well, I was thinking that.
This was about Kathleen. You had mentioned that there's been a certain amount that we have not taken. How much of that is banked, and how much is it all banked and can be taken in the future, or do you lose some of the banked capacity each year? And I'm just curious about that.
I'll have to get back with the specifics, but I believe the general fund, we actually took the bank capacity, so we don't have capacity any longer in that. We may after this year's vote, but I'll have to go back and look at the dollar amounts.
Just curious how in general that works.
I can talk to bank
okay.
capacity. So bank capacity is the difference between the highest lawful levy and whatever amount you actually take in property taxes, right? So if you bank the capacity of the 1% and you don't take it and you do it for a number of years, right? Because the whole pot is growing, it's not like, okay, we didn't take the 1% for 4 years, so now our bank capacity is 4%. The bank capacity is actually a dollar amount, and it's probably going to be after 4 years you know, instead of the 4%, it's probably going to be about 3.96% or 3.95% because the dollar amount you banked as the budget grows and grows and grows, that bank capacity is now not 1% of what it is in this year because percentage deteriorates over time. If that
Okay,
makes
thank you.
sense.
Great. I'm feeling mostly demystified. But I know we can always call on you if we have any
Yes,
further
absolutely.
questions. So thank you very much. This has been very helpful. I think something to present to every council probably every year.
Yes, yeah, and to
Oh,
always remind the citizens that their property tax and all the taxes they pay go for the great services that we provide at a very reasonable
Yeah.
rate.
You know, and I won't call them out by person, but I did run into a person that's on a board in Clark County a few weeks ago, and he asked me, well, what's happening in property taxes? And I go, well, what did you vote for on your board? And he was completely shocked. What are you talking about? And I go, well, you're the one that determines what's happening in property tax in your district. And he's like, no. And I said, yeah, actually you do. So, I mean, this is something that, you know, there's lots of elected officials around the county, I know, that really don't understand exactly how it works. So
Now you are the most informed.
yes.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us. Thank you.
So I've been asked for a 5-minute break so we could come back at 10:30 and then pick up the remaining 2 work sessions. So thanks a lot.